So let me just close by talking about what does that all mean in terms of innovation policies and how we should think about that. I think the biggest and the sort of straightforward thing to make change in this whole field is really to get the fundamentals right. And to me, the most fundamental thing to get right is what it is that economic development, regional economic development, is trying to do. And almost every place has the wrong goal, in my view. And that goal being jobs. Now, that's the right goal when you're in a recession, and it's the right goal for regions with high unemployment. But for most regions, that, I would argue, is at worst a partial goal, and at best, at worst, the wrong goal, and at best, a partial goal. Really, what I think regions should be focused on is creating a high quality of life and a high income for their existing workers. And that's really, it means it's about the quality of jobs, not just the number of jobs. When you focus on the number of jobs, you don't really have any particular reason to focus on innovation. One of the things I didn't show is if you look at this map of the U.S. and you say, who are the most innovative states, states like Massachusetts and Washington State and Virginia, and then say, are those states growing faster than the least innovative states? The answer is no. There is no relationship between innovation capacity and job growth. Zero. There's actually some of the states that are growing quite fast in the U.S. have almost no innovation, like Nevada. If you think of gambling and casinos as innovation, maybe, but they essentially don't do much innovation, and they're very fast growing. However, there is a very strong relationship between innovation strength and per capita income growth. In fact, that's about a 0.4 correlation. So if you want to grow as a region and get richer every year, innovation is pretty much the only way to do that. But if your goal is essentially to just get more jobs, then you don't have to care about innovation. I remember once being interviewed by a reporter on Nevada, the state of Nevada, which is out west in the U.S., and they had just given an incentive package, a tax break, to recruit a company to the state. And the reporter asked me what I thought of that, and the company was a call center that was paying $9 an hour, and the average wage in Nevada was $12 an hour. And I said, well, it's a good strategy if your goal is to lower your standard of living, which is essentially what the state was doing. They were paying to lower their standard of living. So obviously the state didn't like me saying that. The other piece of this, too, is that communities that at least when I go around the country, they really think of themselves in competition with each other or with their neighboring states. And it's so clear, as you all know, that the competition today, particularly in the innovation space, is global, and that if regions don't really recognize that, they're going to be focusing on the wrong things. And then lastly, I alluded to this earlier, but really the only source of competitive advantage for high and moderate income countries is innovation. I remember 20 years ago when I was getting my PhD here at Chapel Hill and talking to the economic development people here in Raleigh, and there was a plant that they wanted, that literally true story, a company that wanted to move from the north, somewhere in Ohio or whatever like that, and bring a couple of hundred manufacturing jobs to North Carolina. But the state and the communities opposed having the plant come to North Carolina. And you ask, well, why was that? Because they were unionized. And the state's focus was so much on, if we bring a unionized plant into North Carolina, it'll raise our wages and we'll lose our competitive advantage. Well, look, 15 years later, you lost all those jobs anyway that were dependent on low costs. Those low-cost dependent jobs aren't here anymore. They're in countries like China, or they're in Mexico, or they're in the Philippines, or they're in other places. So the source of competitive advantage for North Carolina, as frankly the leaders who created the park in the 1950s certainly understood that, the source has to be about innovation. The second thing I'll just add, I certainly could talk a lot about all sorts of policy, but I just want to focus a little bit on higher ed and then close. I think we've reached this point, at least in the U.S., where we've sort of pushed this string as far as we can push it. Our policy towards innovation with regard to higher ed is essentially to induce them to do the right thing by putting in place all sorts of help and incentives. So we give them, we create these research centers, we create research parks, and we do these kinds of programs. But one thing we don't do is we don't hold universities accountable for results. We don't hold them accountable for real commercialization and real economic benefits in the state. So what I would do would be essentially to say, okay, here's the new deal. We will, as a state or the national government, make a significant commitment to increase support for research at universities. But A, we're going to tie it more through firms, so that firms get to sort of almost, if you will, get vouchers that they can spend at universities. And secondly, that we're going to reward universities that do a better job. And how would you do that? I think you could do that. There are lots of easy metrics, I think, that one could use. For example, the number of license agreements, the number of patents, the number of new firms that are in the state, the number of technology partnerships, a whole set of things. Put that all together and say, we'll leave it up to you. You figure out how to do this best. You figure out how to contribute to the regional innovation economy, but we're going to hold you accountable for getting real results. So the last thing I would argue, sorry, here we go. And this is sort of very broad, obviously. I think at the end of the day, what we really need to make this whole movement, if you will, more than just an interesting thing that we do at universities or in our regions, is we really have to elevate the whole notion of innovation into the economic dialogue. If you think about certainly where Washington is, and I think frankly many countries, the people who run economic policy are essentially economists in the Treasury Department or the equivalent thereof. The people who should be running economic policy, or at least be influencing it, are the people in the science agencies or the technology agencies. And if you think about sort of the interesting economic thinking of the last decade or so, people like Paul Romer and Elhanan Helpman up at Harvard, Romer at Stanford, who've really made the very compelling case that economics really simply doesn't understand growth. They can't explain growth. And the people who can are what you would call the innovation economists or endogenous growth theory, whatever name you want to call it. And so what we've tried to do is sort of put that all together under this banner of innovation economics. But I think it has sort of matured enough to be a compelling economic theory, economic doctrine, economic philosophy. But it hasn't matured enough to start to influence policymakers, to get them to understand that, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter, if your top marginal tax rate is 33% or 39%, more or less irrelevant. It doesn't really matter whether you have a little bit more or a little bit less savings or capital. Those are really irrelevant factors. At the end of the day, what matters is, are you an innovative economy, and are you driving innovation throughout your entire economy? That's really how we're going to get growth. And so I would argue that's an important sort of big picture thing to do. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.